And now what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and full screen this. So one of the really, really important things about any talk that I give before we do anything, I have a few ground rules because I think it's really, really important that we kind of get this into our heads as community managers any and every time we can. A lot of people love making plans for communities. And we need to keep doing that because what we are building in online communities is an ecosystem. So we need to have the headlights on in front of our car, right? We need to know where we're going. But what a lot of people will do is they'll plan big and they'll be like, here's what we're doing, here's where we're going. And then they'll hit one little hiccup, one little bump in the road, and suddenly they can't see anything. Things need to change. So they throw the plan out and they're like, okay, no more plans from this point forward. It's just not useful. What we're looking for is a middle ground. So we want to plan big, have headlights in front of our car, and progress small. Don't go so fast that you overwhelm your own headlights. And the best way to do this is to just get good. And then after you've made a few mistakes, use those mistakes to build an iterative plan and get better. Measurement is a muscle, right? And the easiest way to do this is to just take one thing from this talk or from each talk in this conference and then come back later. We're always going to be available later. I'm always available online, as are all of the other brilliant people here. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I'm not going to spend too much time on myself here, but I've been building online communities for about 10 years. I started in the LGBT or queer communities. And one of the big issues was that people did not want to be out online, but they did need the resources in order to live themselves authentically. So I had an issue where I had to simultaneously measure the health and well-being of my online community members, but I had to respect utmost their privacy, security, and anonymity. How exactly do you measure that? So I went to school and I asked, okay, universities, academia, wonderful people of mine, how do I do this? And they said, we don't know. We have no idea. Maybe try business, anthropology, maybe communication. So I took all of these different social scientific departments to hopefully answer my question. And that's kind of what started this whole idea. But enough about me. I want to introduce you to this man. This is John Scully. Throughout the 1980s, he was a really famous marketer on Wall Street. He worked primarily with Fortune 500 companies, and he's really well known for having said, no great marketing decisions have ever been made on qualitative data. If you're in this talk, you probably know he's kicking himself right now because this is very, very wrong. This is Google's entire business model, right? You put keywords or qualitative data into this bar, and Google serves an entire list of web pages that are based off of the qualitative data it collects off of those web pages. So obviously, qualitative data is so important, and it's even the backbone of our big data infrastructure lately. Our retarget marketing processes, our big data processes. We now live in a data abundant world where it's possible now for us to look at what people are saying in order to understand what they really desire and what they really feel. It's up to us to do this responsibly. It's up to us to use that data in order to create viable results for our online communities rather than just spitting out as much data as we possibly can. So here's what we're going to cover today. There's going to be a lot of skipping for this particular talk. But I do want to make sure that as we go through this, you have plenty of opportunity to ask questions and anything like that. So if you do have any questions, please pop them down into the chat. And most critically, if you have any comments or any wisdom that you would like to share, I also want to hear that from you as well, right? You are all absolutely wonderful experts in benchmarking data and in community and in your own brand. So I'd love to hear from you as well if you have something to say in the chat. We're going to be covering community as a social science. As I did say, we are going to fulfill on that promise on how to measure your community using social currency. But in order to do that, we need to understand that social science does have rules. It has rules of generalization, and there are specific ways of handling qualitative data structure. Before I get any further, I just do need to start with this very, very specific statement. Community is a social science. We have to measure it social scientifically. Because community is an aspect of social science, we have a specific shared definition that I want to provide to you now. And this definition comes from 80 years of anthropological research. A community is a well-defined unit of culture. It is simply a space of any specific size with a defined group of people where culture can be built. That means that you're borrowing from the definition of culture. What exactly are you building? A place that includes shared attitudes, values, goals, experiences, practices, and artifacts. Now, the data scientists among us might immediately be thinking, okay, well, what if we attach some metrics that tell us the general attitude of the community or the values? How can we benchmark based upon our goals or our experiences? And you'd be correct. But there are rules to this engagement. So I want to take you back to 6th grade, right? When you first learned about the scientific method, there are specific variables that you take, and based upon those variables, you pull them like levers and you say, I'm going to tweak this one variable and I'm going to learn a little bit more about a thing. And once I've learned that, I have another question. So I'm going to pull another variable. I'm going to change it, tweak it a bit. And over time, over a series of experiments, you understand a thing. I want to be very clear that saying the scientific method should apply to communities is kind of difficult. I'm not saying it doesn't apply, but I am saying it is insufficient for fully studying online community. One more time, the scientific method is insufficient for studying online community. Instead, we need to augment the scientific method, and we use the social scientific process over the course of 80 years to do that. So what are the major changes that occurred in the social scientific process? First things first is radical bias, and we're going to go into each one of these individually. You'll see here that I have a picture of baboons who are kind of fighting. And in anthropology, we discovered that there was a big issue in science when you are removing bias from a circumstance. In many cases, you want to do your utmost to remove bias. But in online communities, and especially in anthropology, in social studies, this is impossible to do. So we have to go the other way and use radical bias. A good example is the baboon situation, wherein a large majority of anthropology throughout 1700s all the way to the early 1940s with Margaret Mead and the 1960s with Dorothy Cheney, everyone thought that baboons were a highly patriarchal society and they were based upon aggression. And in order for you to succeed within a baboon tribe, you had to be the alpha male. We've always heard this concept, but one of the anthropologists who had created this concept decided to test his mettle. He collected 3 female anthropologists. The one that you're probably most familiar with is Jane Goodall, who studied a lot of chimpanzees. But the anthropologist we're concerned with is Dorothy Cheney. She went in and looked at baboon society and discovered that in the vast majority of skirmishes, the vast majority of disagreements between males, it actually had to do with raising children. And the children were all in the hands of the female baboons. In fact, for the vast majority of baboons, coming into the situation of raising a child meant that you had to raise someone else's kid before you could procreate and have your own. We never would have discovered this if it wasn't for the fact that there was a female anthropologist who came in and started looking at the female baboons more than the male baboons. We recognized that the mere gender of an anthropologist completely changed the way that we describe, report on, and understand our results scientifically. Yes, the results are correct, but yes, the data is correct. The data is immutable, but we are the ones inputting the data. We are the ones analyzing the data, and we are the ones reporting out on the data. That's a lot of aspects for bias. So we have to lean into and start reading our communities with deep description in mind. The most important thing to consider is that content is king. Your data is king, but context is queen. You have to focus on that context and provide as much as possible so that other people can pick out your biases and understand where that data might be coming from. This happens in your community on the day-to-day. When you get into disagreements, your super users might have more of a voice than your new users, and you need to manage that bias on the regular. So the next big change to the social scientific method was a change of scope. And what I mean by scope is talking about that environment. What are the limits of the environment that you need to set for your studies? In the scientific method, we study things by changing variables. But if you've been in community for any amount of time, you might recognize that you could do a variable-based test, like an A/B test on your website, in which the specific results come out and you're like, great, we know this. But then a week later, you could run the exact same experiment and get completely different results. You could run that experiment among super users and discover that that experiment doesn't hold among the vast majority of your community members. It just occurs within your super users. That's what we mean by scope. Measuring these individual scopes is critical. As an example, back in 1982, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a famous sociologist, very brilliant mind, decided to put his mind to the simplest possible thing. And this feels so simple for us to know, but he simply said, all society can be stratified into a series of scopes wherein we can study a very specific set of people. And by studying those set of people, we can apply those variables and measure the scope, not the variables. The variables stay the same, but we just measure in different areas, in different scopes, and the scopes become the scientific measurement of change. So when we have inside of our heads a intrapersonal communication, that's a lot like psychology. And then there's an individual interpersonal notion, which is, this is who I am as a person. I'm now pushing it out into the world. How do my friends and family members feel? And then after that, you have an inner community of the shared identities between those individuals. When those shared identities become concrete and a shared mission occurs, you start to build organizations. These organizations build shared identities, missions, and values that develop really powerful presences, almost like people in their own right, but they're not. This is critical. And then those shared identities, those organizations, those communities, those brands move into the wider community. How do they interact with others? How does a OSPO from X company work with a closed brand from X company? And then within all of that, there's this giant scope that we all must play in. Public policy. So this is national policy or the internet, code is law kind of situation. Now, the third thing in social science that we made was the rules of generalization. In order for us to understand and measure the scopes based upon the exact same variables that we have to have rules. There are specific things that we can and cannot do with qualitative data in the social scientific process. There are 5 valid methods of generalizing qualitative data. I'm not going to go into them now. You'll have access to these slides later. But suffice to say, you're not necessarily an anthropologist in your community, right? You're just using the community and you're being informed. So I'm going to give you a shortcut to these 5 valid methods. A concept, this thing is happening in my community, applies to B population among super users and among veteran users, but not new users, only so far as C limitation, but not new users. And it's only happening in this specific quarter of the month. Why? What's happening? So you can now do a social scientific process where you have the exact same variables and you simply change the scope, wherein the scope for this formula is C limitation. And further, you can guess and check your community-based results by using the same formula. A concept applies to B population only so far as C limitation. If you don't have C limitation, may as well bin your data. I'm not saying it's not useful, but you need to go back and do a little bit more research. So let's apply it now. We know that social science requires scopes and it requires a certain amount of time for you to run things. We know that the rules of generalization kind of boil down to A concept, applies to B population, only so far as C limitation. Let's talk about the causation problem. This is the issue where people are like, but does correlation equal causation? What happens there? How do we figure that out? The reality now is because we have limitations, you're able to poke and prod at your results over time. So instead of getting obsessed with the causation issue, but how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? All you need to worry about is, do you have enough data to perform an action? In social science, we call this the saturation point. The saturation point is the point at which any new data coming into your study does not yield new results. You're just repeating the same process over and over and over again. Your data is saturated enough that you are very, very sure the correlation is so heavy, you can just make a choice. You always want to hang out in the middle of this pyramid where you've worked with the data enough and it's useful enough to answer your questions so that you can perform actions. Overall, this is what it's going to look like. I'm not going to go too far into this, but this is what a traditional social scientific process does. Remember, there are some rules. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about this, but we're kind of going to plow on. Now, this next section, I'm really going to be skipping through in order to make sure that we retain some time. If you want more on this specific section, we can do so. But effectively, what we're doing here is just giving you some methods to apply qualitative data that is super, super easy, but not necessarily accurate. Medium level, which is just building that information. Remember, it's a muscle. How do you build the systems for qualitative data? And then we're going to get kind of more difficult and complex over time. So let's talk about making data, quantitative and qualitative data, more viable. This starts by understanding there's a big difference in how you have to treat this data. Qualitative data tracks sentiment, whereas quantitative data tracks behavior. Quantitative data is an abstractive method that only really takes one, maybe two layers of individual behavior and turning it into a number. When a person performs an action, it takes up a number on your backend dashboard that lets you know they've performed an action. Qualitative data adds some layers to this. It tracks user sentiment. So when people have opinions, thoughts, or feelings that can't be tracked via their behavior, you are getting that information in the form of social listening or a contract that says, we've collected this, please capture it and process it. So you have to process it by saying, is it positive or negative? Layer one, the disposition of the comment. What is it about? Is it about your social, is it about your transaction pathway? Is it about your product? Is it about a specific support ticket that happened? So this is cataloging or categorizing where it is. And then there are aspects of sentiment that say, this is about this specific issue they have with their payment pathway. So that's abstraction layer three. What about the payment pathway is negative? What's that information? So you can see that it's moving from highly specific information to abstracting toward general. And that means that you have to organize your data story different. In traditional metrics, you have this thing called the law of numbers, which essentially says, anytime you make a conclusion, the more data you have about it, the more accurate you are. In qualitative data, we don't have that. In lieu of it, we have the rules of generalization. So you have to treat this qualitative data very differently. So let's apply it super, super easy. Like I said, you have radical bias, you have scopes, you have information that needs to come in over time in one area. So the easiest thing that you could do is to build a field journal for your community. Talk about what's happening, where those conversations are occurring, and then start to tag it. track that radical bias, create a hypothesis generator by collecting data over time, and then have a disposition. You'll see over on the right, I recognize it's a little bit blurry, but there are 6 columns here for the date, which is your key information, the category, and then the platform it happened on. Is this a Google review or what are we looking at? The actual information. And then you'll start to add your abstraction or metadata to it. What's the disposition of the comment? Is it positive or negative? And that's just Boolean. Positive equals 1, negative equals 0. You can do more, but just start with this. And then you have a specific set. This message is about the transparency of the company. This message is about whether or not the particular payment path was a useful way to do it. And then you just collect information. And you'll find that if you port this into a dashboard, the easiest way to get results here is to just talk about your kudos and your uh-ohs. And all you need to do is just report out the 5 disposition 1s for the week and the 5 disposition 0s for the week, positive and negative. Now you have 5 kudos and 5 uh-ohs. There you go. Easiest, simplest way for you to use qualitative data. But you might realize that this is all coming from your community manager. The bias is real. So how can you escalate that? You turn your NPS scores, your net promoter scores, public. You can learn more about NPS elsewhere. I'm going to go ahead and skip this for now. But what we really care about is the comments box, which now allows you to collect information from multiple different areas. And it comes with an automatic disposition label. So you can now turn your journal into something more public. In order to scale this, though, you need to come to ground as a team, as an organization, and as a collective with a shared identity. This is the step that virtually everyone skips, and this is why your qualitative data does not scale. A tree might mean something very different from me growing up in Colorado, where I'm built of like a whole bunch of aspen trees and things like that. So when you tell me there's a tree, the image in my mind's eye is probably very different than the tree that you're thinking of halfway around the world or in Australia, in China. You have to come to ground on abstract terms. A tree is difficult enough for us to come to ground on. An abstract concept like transparency in an online community, that's a whole different ballgame. So we need to have these discussions in a systematic way that allow us to change the definition of what we think transparency is in our community to what our community thinks it is over time. The easiest way to do that is a calibration meeting. Just spend a little bit of time calibrating your discussions over time. And I also recommend, in order to do this, using some software that is available and out there. Speaking as someone from chaos, I love Bitergia. I love working a lot with these organizations. But in recent years, we've seen the growth and development of very accessible, super easy to start with community intelligence platforms. I recommend that you look into some of these because they actually have these shared codex terms built into them, disposition engines and comment collectors, all built into the engines. Makes it much easier for you to scale. There are also some more advanced methods. For instance, MaxQDA, I'm very familiar with in academia. You might enjoy their more business-friendly competitor, which is Medallia, but effectively, it allows you to scale your qualitative data. I do want to caution you, though, because as engineers and as data analysts, we love the idea of applying technology to studying all of this data because it is a bit of a fire hose. There's so much of it. But I want you to remember that all of this started with social listening as a contract. AI is not an ear. You need to have a human interacting with and learning about human concepts. It's very important to recognize that automation does not equal conversation at scale. So do the things that don't scale as long as you possibly can. So let's apply it just very fast. Let's apply it to measuring online social currency. This is the promise that I gave y'all. This is just a system that applies a methodology or a theory in social science to your online communities for the day-to-day use. First, we're going to start with a very basic principle. The relationship that you have with your community members grows over time. For a community member, they go through a member journey in which something is very useful to them. Their community is producing something that they find of value. And then as they use it, they start to engage with it and they find success with it. They start to wear the brand and the mission and the values of the community that they're engaging with. They start to engage more and connect. In some cases, they ask, especially in open source, how can I contribute? What can I do? And the number one metric for determining how meaningful a community is that person saying, this community is more valuable than the things that it produces for me. The relationships provide meaning, and they show that by disclosing more about themselves. It's that holy grail of community, self-disclosure. The theory that this is based on is social capital or social currency theory. This is broken into two different concepts. Social capital is the notion of social tokens of trust that are exchanged between people that determine whether or not you trust that person. The notoriety of an individual, how bonding they can be, and how they can connect with other people. We call that bridging capital. This kind of capital is collected by creating a brand or a personal identity of your own and then giving things away. Social currency is concerned with the behaviors that elicit the exchange of that social capital. So how do you be more transparent? How do you show that you're useful? How do you show that you're a consistent individual that people can trust? How do you build merit? So social capital is concerned with the actual currency that's exchanged. Social currency is concerned with the behaviors that create those exchanges. So kind of coming back to that idea of a codex, what I want you to do to start using the social currency metric system is to literally just build a codex and define these terms. What does transparency mean to you and your key stakeholders? What about utility and consistency? When a person is exhibiting that they trust you more, why are you thinking that they trust you more? Is this a transparency statement or is it a utility statement? Someone says, your product is super, super handy. That's probably more of a utility statement. Or something like, I can always trust Threado to always feed back. That's more of a consistency statement. So you want to define these terms in your own codex and then start to tag them in your systems. And at the end of it all, you should have a dashboard that looks somewhat like this, where based upon your own definition of transparency, whenever someone gives a comment and you read it and you say, this is a transparency play, the transparency dashboard will tick up 1. And then you'll find that you're rich in specific areas of social capital, like utility, but not so much in areas like transparency. How can you fix that? In some cases, it might be your product is really useful, but we know nothing about the maintainers or the project analysts who are a part of this. So maybe launch a YouTube video that says the back end of our project, a day in the life of X person who's responsible for managing this. And you'll start to see that that utility and that transparency starts to creep up in your community. Overall, you're gaining a certain sense of notoriety that results in greater reputation. So in practice, this is how you might see it. You might see that you're very, very rich in one area when it comes to your travel or lodging for your events or something like that, but it might be very, very low in another area, like your payment path. Your payment system may have very low utility, but your product has very high utility. What happened there? Where's the disconnect and what can you do to solve that problem? So if you liked this talk, if you were interested, I'm always happy to continue the conversation. You can connect with me on Twitter. Again, the full presentation will go onto my YouTube channel, but I'm more than happy to have a deeper conversation about implementing qualitative data in your community. Social currency theory is just an example, and we didn't get to go into the nuts and bolts of it, but I'd love to answer any questions or anything like that if you have it. That's it.